Okay, welcome back to part three. Um, so you see, Nixon is portrayed as a well-known man of the world, a statesman. He's managed to get a lot done in his first and beginning of his second administration. So we're going to take a change now. We're going to switch over to his domestic agenda, and let's take a look at what Nixon looks to do in the United States for the administration. All right. So something you want to think about. He is a Republican president. He has a Democratic Congress. It's going to be difficult to get everything he wants done completed. He does do some things. He expands Social Security. SSI benefits for people who are disabled and get Social Security benefits, that comes under Nixon's administration. So remember, you've got a Republican who's, and again, the Republicans and the conservatives are not happy that he is doing this. Aid to dependent children comes in there. Clean air and clean water. I know it comes under the Great Society, but Nixon puts in place the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. All right? This is something that many candidates today on the Republican side are looking to get rid of. Okay? OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, comes in under Nixon's agenda, Nixon's tutelage as part of his thing. And of course, Title IX. So ladies, if there are any of you out there who play sports and will plan on playing sports in college, and the sport is there for you, you can thank Richard Nixon and Title IX for this, okay? I know my daughter was a partaker of this process, and I think it's an awesome thing. It leveled the playing field, pun intended, and it brought everybody to a better place. So there's still some discrepancy or discussion about this, but in all honesty, I think it was a good program. All right, so these are some things for Nixon's domestic policy. On his domestic agenda also, we see things like the Philadelphia Plan. This was a program for affirmative action. Now, remember, you got to go back and look at the case that affirmative action comes in with, and that was the Bakke case, Bakke, Regents of California versus Bakke. And if you haven't read about it in the book, do that, please. You need to take a look at the Bakke case. It's important to understand, and it's where we are. And today, I believe this, if not this term, I think it's not this term, next term, the Supreme Court has agreed to look at the idea of affirmative action again. So there's something that's still it's still around, it's still bounced back and forth, and we're going to take a look at it. If I was a betting person this time, I would bet the Supreme Court would say affirmative action is no longer constitutional. It came up in 2003, and it was dealt with a case at the University of Michigan Law School, and basically a white candidate was denied acceptance over African-American candidate as part of the university's affirmative action program. He sued the Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote, and that was before Roberts and Alito got on the court, but in a 5-4 vote, affirmed Bakke and didn't overturn it. So that's something that's important to think about. He tries to reduce the New Deal and the Great Society. He thinks they're too permissive. He starts coming up with the term welfare cheats. All right, Reagan's going to call them welfare queens, but they're welfare cheats. Woodstock happens during this time, and of course, think about Nixon, the law and order candidate. Remember in the video it talked about Spiro Agnew. Agnew's his attack dog. He goes out and wants to shut down these hippies and these people. He's got to deal with that. SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. A group develops out of that. They're from the far left. They're known as the Weathermen. And these guys are advocating violent overthrow of the government. These guys are almost anarchists, okay? So think about that when you take a look at all the stuff that's going on. Remember, SDS starts in the 1960s, so you really need to have that process going. All right, next up, he's got economic problems, okay? And he needs to figure out a way to slow federal spending. So instead of trying to cut the programs, because he knows he can't get that done with a Democratic Congress, he takes the responsibility for paying for the programs and gives it to the states. he gives them a lump sum of money. So he would give the state of New Jersey X billions or millions of dollars and tell New Jersey, it's up to you to figure out how to spend it. This is known as New Federalism. Okay, it's an important term to understand. It's just called the New Federalism. It is not a good program. Okay, it doesn't really work. But again, he's trying to figure out a way to change what's happening. He's got economic problems. He does try to go around Congress. Something he does is he'll take money that was appropriated for Social Security and he'll say, I'm not going to spend it. And so what does Congress do? It sues the president in court, gets to the court, and the courts always side with Congress. So he tries to do some things, but it doesn't really work for him. A new economic term comes up in the economy. It's called stagflation. This is famous in the 1970s. The economy is stagnant. It's not moving anywhere, but inflation is going nuts. We are seeing interest rates of 8, 10, 15, 20% interest rates. Incredible. Okay, inflation is runaway. And a lot of this can be tied all the way back to, the old guns and butter approach. When Johnson tried guns and butter, it doesn't work. So some of the things Nixon does, again, he tries to cut spending or supplements. That gets us into a recession and high unemployment. So that doesn't work. He does try some Keynesian ideas or putting in some stimulus packages. And basically, he just does it to placate people. The middle class, the working poor, they're screaming that they want some help from the government. And none of this works, okay? The government is unable to do this. So it's still not working, and Nixon still has a problem in terms of what's happening with the economy. All right, next up, what does he do? Wage and price freezes. The idea here in economic terms is if you can't make more money, then you don't need to pay more for prices. So he freezes prices and he freezes wages. People are not allowed to get more money, so the manufacturer, whatever you're earning is frozen, and at the same time, whatever the manufacturer is charging for the product, that's frozen too. It doesn't really work well. He will also take us off the gold standard. He puts a big surcharge on imports. This is a huge tariff he puts in as a way to try to force Americans to buy domestic goods as opposed to buying imported goods, okay? And it doesn't work. He's reelected in 72. Again, he takes all these controls off and none of it works. The inflation continues and the country is still in a major economic funk. Okay, what else does he do? He increases Social Security and cost of living payments. So again, in one hand, he's trying to cut back on things by impounding Social Security's money. In the other hand, he's arguing to give people more money. COLA stands for cost of living adjustments. So that's where your Social Security goes up as, if the rate of inflation is 2% a year, your cost of living it costs 2%, you get 2% more in your Social Security, okay? The Soviet Union was having terrible grain problems. They were not able to grow much of their food. They had major crop failures. So what does Nixon do? He sells them American grain. It leads to shortages at home. Shortages at home, price goes up. Supply and demand. It's very simple. Okay? I talked to you before about the oil embargo and what that does to the United States and how we're waiting in lines and gas prices are going up. And really who's hit is Detroit. This is the beginning of the American automobile industry having its first major problem, okay? Its first major problem in terms of what to do. Detroit is building cars that get about 8 miles to the gallon. And that's great. I mean, I owned one of those giant clunkers. It rode like a boat. It was great. It had a big engine in it. It sucked gas. But when you're buying gas at 20 cents a gallon, it's not that big a deal. And I know this is going to sound crazy for you guys, but when gas is up to 40, 50, 60 cents a gallon, it's a major price increase for people at the time. And so what happens is This is where Americans start turning away from Chevrolet or General Motors and Chrysler and Ford, and they start buying cars from Toyota and Nissan. And Nissan at the time was called Datsun, okay? And this is where you start to see also Volkswagen is able, the German car manufacturer, is able to make a large inroad into the United States too. So you've got this competition, you've got all these things out there, and it's driving the economy crazy. People are having problems, joblessness, high unemployment, high inflation. People can't survive, don't know what they're going to do for their next meals, and all of this is taking place under Nixon's watch. And it's taking place at the same time he is being seen as this great statesman. Okay, so he's getting a little concerned. He's got to shore up his base for the 1972 election, and he sends out the Vice President Spiro Agnew as an attack dog. And the purpose of Agnew is to go out there and tell the world, or tell the rest of the United States, or tell Nixon's base, his core constituents, what's wrong with the world. And everything that he can come up with is wrong with the world. The Woodstock hippies, right? We talked about Woodstock, we talked about hippies, we talked about San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury district. They are causing the problem. Nixon is big on dividing people. It's us against them. They're the bad guys. The Weathermen, I mentioned them earlier. They are the radical arm of Students for Democratic Society, or SDS. The war protesters are bad. These people are not good Americans. They are not nice people. They're young. They're privileged. And they are complaining about going to war. You've got women's liberation. Go think all the way back to Betty Friedan and her book. She is now in her 50s or late 50s, early 60s at this point, and she is definitely a leader in the women's liberation movement, okay? This is also the beginning of where you start to see the Republican Party call the academia as Eastern liberal academia. It's a phrase, it's a term that is placed on these people, okay? The liberal press, the liberal media. This term is not really used before Agnew. It was designed to try to get people to think that it's not Nixon's fault, but it's the paper's fault. It's not Nixon's fault that the unemployment rate is so high, it's the war protesters. It's not Nixon's fault that the country is coming apart, it's the Woodstock hippies. It's not Nixon's fault that the economy is tanking, it's the Eastern liberal academians who are not willing to do anything. All right, you getting the idea here, I hope? Nixon is trying to put the blame on everybody else, and Agnew is the guy who does it. All right, he is the person who goes out, and he is the person who puts it together, okay? He tries to increase presidential power and reshape the courts. Nixon is big on something called executive privilege and signing statements. You should all be familiar with the term signing statements. All presidents use them. Now, interestingly enough, a couple of the people in Nixon's administration are people you might know today. For example, Dick Cheney was George Bush's vice president. He was part of Nixon's administration. If you look at some of the stuff, and the Secretary of Defense during Bush's presentation, whose name is not coming up to me right now, he is also part of Nixon's process. If you look at the programs that they tried to do in the 1970s, look at them again when they're in power in the 2000s. And you will see that they are much more successful in 2000 than they were in the 1970s. Okay? So this is pretty much what's taking place on his domestic agenda. We have much more to talk about. When I come back with the next part, we'll do Nixon's Southern strategy, and we'll start to look at how the wheels come off the bus for Nixon and his administration. All right? So I'll be back with the next part in a moment.